Cannae is one of my shorter books. It's a similar length to Roman Warfare, only about 40,000 words. And it grew really from writing the book on the Punic Wars, Fall of Carthage as it became, but also it was part of what was planned to be another series. So I'd already done Roman Warfare for the series edited by John Keegan. This series was edited by another great historian, military historian, Richard Holmes, both of them coming from that Sandhurst teaching group that did so much to shape military history in Britain for decades really afterwards. And the idea was to look at key historical battles and describe them in detail. Now, the series didn't quite come out as people had planned. Various things happened, so a lot of the books were never released or were released in a different format. And it was perhaps one of those things where the initial one was a little bit too expensive for what it was and perhaps a little bit too detailed. However, the book's still in print, it's been re-released, and I think it's, as good a study as I could make it. Cannae is one of those few battlefields where you can narrow down the location of the site to within a relatively small area, but we do have problems. Normally, any military historian worth his salt or her salt, looking at a more recent period, will want to walk the ground. They'll want to look at the topography, they'll want to look at where the battle occurred, what the contours are like, sometimes the detail that you don't get even on the best of maps, that impression, that reminder of just what's visible from one position to the next. The problem is that Polybius, who gives us our main details for placing the site precisely, uses the river Aufidius as his sort of guide for all of it. So the various armies, it's on their left, it's on their right. And that river moves. When I went there in round about late 90s, I think it was, rather than the book came out in about 2000, 2001, then I had 3 or 4 different maps showing the line of the river. On the ground, it was completely different, even that summer. And while people say, oh, well, couldn't you do archaeological work, try and find mass graves, weapons, that sort of thing? Well, you probably could, but it's very expensive. And there have been other battles, particularly a couple of medieval battles in the same area. So reports that in the past mass graves were discovered, fragments of weapons, don't necessarily tell us very much. I've gone for an interpretation based very much on the numbers as far as we can tell, the sort of area that they would occupy when deployed in the formations as described, and also trying to understand the logic behind the Romans' decisions, because they've been challenged to battle by Hannibal on a succession of days and they haven't accepted it. They declare battle to him. They move their army out and deploy before he does on the day of the battle itself, and they deploy with the river on their right flank. And I think it's because they've occupied an area where it's fairly narrow between the hill on which the town of Cannae rests and the river itself, on the basis that in the earlier battles of the war, Hannibal has tended to outflank them. They know he's got more cavalry, probably better cavalry, but certainly more very confident cavalry. And the Romans know they've got a lot more infantry than Hannibal. So the idea is to smash through his centre with your infantry, which you've managed to do even at the defeat in Trebia, and that part of the vanguard had done when ambushed at Trasimene the year before. So you know your good, tough Roman farmers turned legionaries are going to carve their way through almost any opposition to their front if you allow them time to do it. Then that's the plan. Give yourself time. Let your cavalry just hold the Carthaginian cavalry back and hold them off as long as possible, and then punch through their centre, smash their army in the centre, destroy them that way. There won't be much that Hannibal can do about it. And from that, I think you can best understand Hannibal's tactics as well. There have been various ideas trying to trace the genesis of the idea for what's done at Cannae back to Hannibal's father or Hannibal's earlier battle. Personally, I think it's far more likely to tie into that specific situation and the terrain. This is Hannibal as a good general, reading the battle, reading his enemy's intentions, reading the landscape, and turning what the Romans think is their great advantage, the power of their mass centre, into a weakness. Because he sucks that centre into a trap, basically lures them into a box with some of his best troops on either side, the cavalry coming in behind them, and they're trapped and they're largely annihilated. It is an appalling battle in terms of its scale, in terms of its losses. 50,000 dead, perhaps more, in a single day of fighting. All done by sword, by spear, sometimes by slingstone, by javelin, but all by muscle-powered weapons. Even when it's a sling or some of the few bows that may have been present, no one is killed from very far away. The person who's doing the killing could see the face of the man he's throwing or shooting a missile at. And much of it was done hand to hand, with spear, with sword. And that's probably why there's such a nightmarish element, particularly to the accounts of Livy and some of the others, of this appalling slaughter. Because killing 50,000 men is not an easy thing to do, even when they're tactically at such a disadvantage, even when many of them may have given up. They may have stopped fighting or been unable to fight effectively. And yet you still have to kill them one by one. One of the more striking things about the battle that often gets ignored is the high casualty rate suffered by Hannibal's army. It's between 5,000, perhaps as much as 8 or even 10, depending on the sources. So Hannibal loses anything up to about 10% of his own force. That's more than twice the average for a victorious army in the ancient world. Because in the ancient world, most people die in battle when the army is broken, when they're running away, when they're helpless, when the enemy pursues them and kills at will. And the Romans didn't break at Cannae, or at least most of them do not. Most of them are simply trapped and have to be killed one by one. It's also mentioned by Polybius that Hannibal lost many of his best men and leaders. It's the people who will keep going forward, who will lead the men into combat, inspire them to keep fighting, who take the risks and inevitably suffer a higher rate of casualties than everyone else. So Hannibal's army is seriously damaged by Cannae. But of course the big strategic truth of this whole campaign is that Hannibal wins one of the most devastating battlefield victories ever won by any army in any period, and particularly striking given that he's outnumbered. He has more cavalry, but overall the Romans have almost twice the size of his force. And it's a pretty good, coherent army, though a lot of it's inexperienced, it hasn't manoeuvred together very much. Nevertheless, these Romans are pretty tough, they are hard to beat, and yet Hannibal does it. Hannibal doesn't just defeat them, he destroys them. Because on top of the dead that he's caused, he takes tens of thousands of prisoners as well. The remnants of the Roman army is very, very small that escaped. And yet, at the end of this, when Hannibal sends envoys with some to negotiate an exchange of prisoners, as was normal in the campaigns of the Second Punic War up to now and right the way through the First Punic War, this is what civilized nations do. You ransom your prisoners, and whoever's doing better in the war gets to pay less to get theirs back than the one who's losing. The Romans not only refuse to ransom anybody, but they refuse to let the ambassadors stay on Roman soil for more than a day. They will not negotiate. Ancient conflicts are ended by negotiation, by one side admitting, yeah, fair enough, we've lost for the moment, we'll make concessions, we'll give you some territory maybe, we'll give you some money, some gold, some treasure, some reparations, and most of all, we'll yield prestige to you. We'll admit that we've been defeated, that you are stronger than us. The Romans refuse to do that. And even though Hannibal will win other victories in Italy, not quite on the scale of Cannae, but still serious defeats as far as the Romans are concerned, the Romans refuse to give in. The Senate will not negotiate, the Senate does not break up. It's not like many a Greek state where there were exiled aristocrats with the invading army. The Romans system just doesn't work that way. So the Romans don't give up. So the paradox is that when in subsequent generations people have tried to inflict cannaes on their opponents, and it was a particular obsession of the Prussian and then German high command in the late 19th century and into the Second World War. Obviously von Schlieffen is the famous example, but people like Rommel talk about inflicting cannaes on the British in the desert. Nobody seems to point out that, okay, this is a great tactical victory, but it doesn't lead to success in the war. So Cannae remains a mystery. And this book was about trying to understand the mechanics of it all, not just its place in wider history, but what actually happened as far as we can tell and what it was like for people on the day.